So welcome to today's seminar on LGBTQI plus freedom and liberal democracy. Thank you for joining us to discuss these most important issues, especially during these tense and difficult times for freedom and democracy worldwide. We're very pleased to co-host this seminar together with RFSL Youth. And now I hand over to you, Elias, the president of RFSL Youth. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I will do a little bit of this mic shuffling exercise that I always have to do. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, distinguished panelists, and Ulrika for inviting us to, I was going to say your home. This is kind of your home, right? Your office. As Ulrika said, I'm president of RFSL Ungdom, which is Sweden's only child and youth-led LGBTI rights organization. So we work locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally to ensure the protection of the human rights of and equal treatment and well-being of children, young people, and young adults who are LGBTQI persons. What my members across the country are telling me right now is that we are living in a time where there is a very strong LGBTI movement. I saw this year that we are having, for the first time, I think, in Sweden, over 100 Pride celebrations this year, which is amazing. Yeah, an applause for that. Never before has the LGBTQI movement been so strong here in Sweden or internationally. Never before has the mainstreaming of the rights of LGBTQI persons been so mainstream. But at the same time, movement creates a reaction. Every movement creates a reaction. And we're also seeing an anti-LGBTQI movement that is also an anti-women's rights movement, an anti-democracy movement, an anti-human rights movement growing a bit, but mostly being very, 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 I would not even say vocal, just loud. And in this context, I'm so glad that we were able to arrange this seminar, and we're having some amazing panelists, which James will introduce to you in, now. So thank you, James, for moderating this session.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
I'll stand up to begin with. Hi, I'm James Savage. I am founder and publisher of The Local, and I'm going to be moderating this panel today. So what we're going to be looking at today is taking a look at where LGBTQI rights are today and where they've come from and where they're going to. It felt a few years ago like LGBTQI rights were moving forward. Country after country in the Western world and beyond was recognizing same-sex marriage, and acceptance of LGBTQI people was on the rise in lots of places. You could believe easily Martin Luther King's fantastic phrase about the arc of moral universe bending towards justice. But these days, perhaps the picture sometimes feels a bit more mixed. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen Ghana following Uganda and moving forward with an extreme anti-homosexuality law that would criminalize same-sex relations, would criminalize being transgender, and would criminalize advocating for LGBTQI plus rights. In Italy, closer to home, we've seen gay parents being forced to being forcefully removed from their children's birth certificates. And they're also considering there a law that would make it a criminal offence to have a baby by surrogacy abroad. Now, that's just a couple of examples. There are plenty more. But let's see from our panel whether they think that things are moving forwards or moving backwards, whether they're optimistic or pessimistic. So for the next few minutes, for the next 50 minutes or so, we will have a fantastic panel. Comprising, I'll introduce them one by one, Paulina Brandberg, who is Sweden's Minister for Gender Equality and represents the Liberal Party. Please come up, Paulina. Peter Sidlund Ponkala, who is acting chairman of RFSL. Erik Ramanathan, who is ambassador to Sweden from the United States and has been an activist for LGBTQI rights for the past 30 years. Welcome. Ulrika Westerlund from Miljöpartiet, the Green Party, who is a parliamentarian and HBTQI spokesperson for the Green Party. And Elias Felander, who is... Oh, I had you on the... No, sorry, you're not joining the panel. Sorry. Yeah. Strike that. So, welcome all. Lovely to have you here. So, we're going to take it sort of person by person to begin with, but I'd like you all to interject where you've if you've got a comment on what someone else on the panel is saying, and also to make this a bit of a general discussion. But we're going to start looking at Sweden, and Peter, if we look back not that many years, just over 43 years ago, homosexuality in Sweden was classified as a mental disturbance by the National Board of Health and Welfare, and it only got abolished as a result of some really strong actions by activists in Sweden who occupied the department's offices, and then Barbara Westerholm, who was, I think, a hero for many people in the LGBTQI movement in Sweden, was active as general director of the Board of Health and Welfare in getting rid of that. How do you think we've progressed in Sweden since then? Are we going forward? Have we gone backwards? And where are we now?
Thank you, James. 1979 was indeed a very remarkable year for LGBTQ people in Sweden, and I also think it's proof of the power of activism, that you can actually change and you can make the world a better place. I think since 1979 we've come a long way. In the 80s, progress halted, largely due to the AIDS crisis. But then in the 90s, we saw a rapid development. We had, for example, in 1995, we had the legalization of LGBTQ partnerships, and LGBTQ people were included in the anti-discrimination laws in Sweden in 1998. And this rapid development progressed until the early years of this, or the mid 2010s, when we saw the latest number of changes for the better, so to speak. We had, for example, in 2013, we had the abolition of forced sterilizations of trans people, for example. But since then, I'd say that progress has halted a bit. And even if we have to remember that we are enjoying, we're living in a time when public acceptance is generally very large. I think a testament to that is the large number of Pride celebrations we have in Sweden. We have, as Elias mentioned, over 100 Pride celebrations in Sweden, and we have a lot of people who participate in all of these. But we also see a slightly worrying development quite recently, where we have this small but very, very vocal anti-rights movement that makes itself heard and spreads quite vicious vitriol, and is questioning LGBTQ people's and the rights of LGBTQ people, and especially the rights of trans people, and that's quite worrying, and it puts a very heavy onus on the rest of the community to stand up for each other and for everyone around us to actually confirm these rights that we have been given. So I think that's where we are at the moment. Thank you.
how do you, the rest of you on the panel, do you see that as well? Are you concerned that things are in the last few years have started going in the wrong direction in Sweden in particular? Paulina.
Well, I think both in Sweden and in many other countries, there are a big risk of pushbacks in the times that we are living in. We do see a more polarized society. We do see these anti-LGBTQI plus movements. And also, I'm afraid that now that we have big crises like the Russian aggression that takes a lot of focus, then there is always a risk that there is a backlash when it comes to human rights, because people are looking in another direction, and then that's when you can go forward with pushbacks, and people don't react as much to it because they're focused on other things. So I think there is absolutely reason to be worried and to be to work even harder, not only to push forward, but also to defend the gains that we've made.
Ulrika, how do you would you agree that we need to do more to defend the gains that we've made and to keep pushing forward?
You're like laying it out for me. Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation for this exciting talk. Yes, I very much agree with the description that Peter gave, that we saw a quite rapid development. And now, since we're celebrating Stockholm Pride this week, it's also important to acknowledge that it was kind of when Stockholm Pride then 25 years ago became this big event that we now see. There were celebrations also before that, but with Europride in 1998, it was this big visibility, and that has definitely served the community very well. So if you don't see us in a broad sense, kind of if you're not visible in the mainstream media, then it's much easier to ignore the demands that have been put forward. So obviously the LGBTI movement of Sweden had worked for decades before Stockholm Europride 1998, but it was with that you saw this rapid development. But there has been a stall, and it has been. You can see it very clearly. For example, if you look at this map that this umbrella organization ILGA Europe produces every year, where they rank countries, and then you can see other countries kind of going ahead of us, even though it's not a super drastic development. You can see Sweden is kind of fluctuating between 12th and 4th place over the last 10 years. Now we are at 8th place, and the reason that we are kind of moving down on this ranking is not because rights have been removed in Sweden. It's because other countries have moved ahead and gone ahead with doing reforms that we haven't done. For example, legal gender recognition based on self-identification that now all other Nordic countries have, apart from us, and also Spain has and other countries. So it's a halt here, but not in all countries.
Ambassador, coming here from America with fresh eyes, but with a long history of working with LGBTQI rights, what's your perspective been on the progress that Sweden has made, and where Sweden maybe has potential to improve? If you could be so undiplomatic.
Well, obviously, I think there's. I have been doing this work for 35 years, and I think, frankly, we've seen Sweden move often in parallel with many of the developments across. So it might be easier for me to talk about the American context a little bit. But I think it's possible to be both extremely concerned, even alarmed, and think there's great urgency to pushing back against the rhetorical forces and the anti-human rights forces of the world today, but also be an optimist for the long term, because the reality is, in the 35 years I've been doing this, there have been a lot of ebbs and flows. There's been periods where things have been moved forward fairly rapidly, and other times that there have not, and there have been retrograde forces, which is not to excuse that at all, but merely to say that there has been, as we worked on the HIV crisis, things seemed like there was no traction for an incredibly long time, and then there were great strides ahead, and it's been the same in many other ways. So it's really been 55, 60 years of tremendous progress if you look over time. But a lot of that has been focused on acceptance, particularly family acceptance. To some extent, community and societal extents, there's still more work to be done. Family acceptance has really moved forward a lot. And then on the rights side, huge leaps forward, particularly recently in legal rights, but they're the rights that the state can confer, their marriage, their, the ability to serve in the military and the diplomatic corps, their, there are other things where the state is directly involved. And I think what we're seeing now with all this populist and anti-human rights fervor is that private actors are very emboldened to feel that they can push back against what is happening more broadly. And the real conundrum, at least as I see it from the U.S., is how can government constrain private action by people who control employment, landlords who control housing, the things that healthcare, private doctors and hospitals who don't give healthcare rights, things like that. That's a much, much harder area, and that's the area that I feel is truly emboldened as far as the rhetoric and the political movements of the moment that are spreading throughout the world is taking this private action and not having it under control. And I'm not sure that, so it will take a whole of society effort to do that. The state needs to be involved. Activists, civil society need to be involved. Frankly, business and private sector needs to be involved in order to really figure out how we're going to continue that momentum. And I think a lot of it's stalled right now. I mean, the other thing I would say, obviously we see this. President Biden, on the very first day in office, signed an executive order, asking all of the federal government agencies to do whatever they can as a government to push back against that discrimination that's being seen. But there are limits to how much can be done by executive action when it's not a law, when it's not holding up in court and other things. So there's, the president is the very biggest supporter of gay rights, and thinks that everyone should be able to live free and equal. But delivering on that is very challenging in countries like ours.
There's a very large LGBTQI plus civil rights organization, the Human Rights Campaign, that's declared a state of emergency due to what it says is a tidal wave of increased homophobia and transphobia. Is this a picture that you recognise?
Well, it is. It is definitely something I recognize. I mean, it's more and more uneven throughout geography across the United States in different communities. People have very, very, very different experiences, and they're tremendously difficult places. Again, partly with the emboldened private sector action amplifying whatever legal differences are on a state-by-state basis, for example, in the United States. I mean, the president has, called out, for example, the Florida Don't Say Gay, laws as just absolutely abhorrent. I mean, completely, the fact that the parents of, transgender children, not to mention the children themselves, are, being just pilloried in, school meetings and other public squares over stances that they're taking is just, that's just an abomination, really. And we need to find ways of continuing to advance the discussion and bringing community together, or else there is real possibility that we will have very much a very different experience depending on what part of the country you live in and what part of the world you live in.
Well, I think one question that some people on this side of the Atlantic often wonder is, particularly with after the decision on abortion by the Supreme Court, is same-sex marriage completely safe in America with the Supreme Court we've got now? Are you able to comment?
I don't believe that any right we've ever won is ever 100% safe. I think we see that with abortion. I don't think there's an imminent threat to same-sex marriage rights in the United States, but there are. I think we always have to fight for the gains that have been made until we reach a much higher state of equality and visibility. You know, the transgender community is still in many ways fighting often what the broader gay community fought 20 or 30 years ago, just for simple safety. You know, not being exposed to violence, not being threatened at the same level, and that's so. I don't think we're even close to where we would be able to say, you know, this right is enshrined. And obviously all this, you know, any work done by executive action by the president and others who have incredibly good intentions are not effective for the long term until they're enshrined in law. So we also need to find ways to move our legislatures forward to make sure that we're not just passing a policy, but passing laws that can survive court challenges.
Yeah. I mean, Ulrika, do you see in Sweden similar challenges to those that the ambassador's describing for the US? And what would you like to see Sweden? What are your priorities for LGBTQI policies for Sweden going forward?
I think Paulina knows what I'm going to say now. Sorry, it's the Legal Gender Recognition Act, which has been dragged out in absurdity by a number of governments. So it's not like, this is not something that you can entirely blame on the current government, although I see the specific challenges that might be in this particular situation, but obviously the former government didn't manage to deliver this either, because this has been something that has been, yeah, it's been almost 10 years since this, like, the serious proposal to change it to be based on self-identification came. And before that, the community had tried to change it for even longer. So it's like, this is a long process. And unfortunately then, the resistance to it, like when I was the president of RFSL between 2010 and 16, and in those days, we worked on this very much. We focused from 2010 to 2013, we focused a lot on removing the forced sterilizations that was mentioned previously. And that was then done, has to be said, that the courts won over the politics. So a court said, you can't have this, you can't forcibly sterilize people because they want to change legal gender. So a court said that before politicians managed to change the law. So that we can just have as a mental note for how hard that was even to change. And even then we were thinking kind of, is this strategic? Should we go for a complete reform of the law, or should we just try to remove this, the most offensive and violating of human rights thing that is in this legislation? And now I'm really happy that we decided to go for the removal of the forced sterilizations, because not in my wildest imagination I could think that we were going to be here now, then more than 10 years later after we did this. I didn't see that coming. So, and the resistance towards changing this law has now the conservative position on it has been joined by other types of debaters and people who have opinions about this that you could maybe not describe as conservative, that maybe have a position that this is in some way threatening women's rights, or that this is something that... so it's like a completely new argument that didn't exist when I was the president of RFSL. And this we have also seen around the world, unfortunately, that this... the right-wing extremists and the very conservative religious people, for example, are joined by people who are not right-wing extremists and not very conservative religious people, but argue from other positions, but they say similar things. And this, of course, creates tension and insecurity among politicians who don't really know how to understand these arguments.
But is that not, I mean, is that a discussion that we should be having a sort of a saklig, what's the word in English? But you know, a saklig discussion on the subject rather than a rational, you know, looking at the issues rather than a saklig discussion on the subject rather than
Yes, I'm all for discussing this based on like facts, and for example, then looking of what's happened in other countries who have changed the law like this already. Has anything bad happened to women's rights, for example, or like what's that is a fact that you can use in your discussion, and then really have a discussion about what gender is, what sex is, what how we define that in different law. I'm all for that. It's a lot of the current discussion is not based in facts. It's something else that I think is quite hard to also understand, because the aggressiveness that sometimes come on like social media, for example, is from this crowd is unfortunately very similar to the aggressiveness that comes from, like, for example, right-wing extremists. It's really confusing and strange, I think, for many people.
Paulina, I think you've said in the past that you would like to enact legislation to enable self-identification, but so far we haven't had any. What's causing this delay?
To start with, I would just like to say that I completely agree with Ulrika that the legislation that we have today is completely outdated. It's from 1972. As we heard here initially, there has been a big today we have a lot more modern view on these issues, and that should of course be reflected in our legislation. There is an ongoing work in the government offices on this act, and it's this is a work that has come far, and it's my sincere hope that we will soon be able to present a proposal on a new Gender Identification Act, because I know that this is a legislation that's very there are so many people that are touched by this law, that are affected by this law, that have been waiting way too long for this.
Do you feel that when you bring this legislation forward, do you sense that you have support across the four parties that your government is reliant on for support in the Riksdag? Well, in this issue, it's only the three government parties, because this is not part of the TIDE agreement. Yeah. So when during these discussions, it's only Liberalerna, Moderaterna, and Kristdemokraterna. Sverigedemokraterna are not around the table because it's not part of the TIDE agreement. And there are, we still have details to discuss, of course, otherwise we would have put it on the table already. But I'm really hoping that we will be able to present something that will gain, support not only within the government, but also across, party lines. And obviously, I'm hoping for the support from the Miljöpartiet and also other parties. But so I take from your answer that you don't have complete alignment within the government on this yet. There are still issues to resolve. As Christian Democrats, I think we've. But the important is there is an ongoing work, and I'm hoping that we will be able to present a proposal soon. From RFSL's standpoint, what are your hopes for this legislation? Do you think it's got a chance of? Are you hoping that it's still going to get through this mandate period?
Yes, definitely, and we're waiting for it. We're very excited to see it being tabled.
Paulina Brandberg, I'd like to come back to you on another question now, because it's one thing to talk about Sweden, where in many respects we've made enormous progress over the last few years, but we're seeing some countries where we're not progressing, where things are going backwards, really, regardless of your perspective. We're seeing that, just for a few examples, within the EU, we've seen LGBTQI plus parents in Italy being removed from their children's birth certificates. We've seen Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland with terrible records on gay and trans rights. So when you look at countries in the EU, when you are talking with EU colleagues, when your ministerial colleagues are talking with EU colleagues, what are you doing to address these issues that are affecting LGBTQI plus people in other European countries? and just try and advance their rights within the European Union?
Well, first of all, what you're mentioning is extremely worrying, and I think it's important as a representative for the Swedish government to really do what I can and what we can do in the government to affect other EU countries. We just finished the EU presidency in Sweden, and during that presidency, we arranged a conference on LGBTQI rights, which I think it's an important way to put these issues on the agenda. But I also think it's important. In my job, I have a lot of bilateral meetings with the ministers from other countries all the time, and I think it's very important not to be afraid of awkward conversations, because when you bring this up with these kinds of different countries where they do have these pushbacks, there are awkward situations, because the conversations are not as friendly anymore, because it's obvious that we have different standpoints. But I think it's important to raise this, and also to be very, very clear on the Swedish position that this is a matter of basic human rights. That's what it is, and that's you need to stand up for those, always. And for myself also, this week I'm participating in Pride here in Sweden. In a couple of weeks, I will participate in Pride in Poland. And that, for me, that's, of course, it's the most important to participate in Sweden. But there, the urgency to take a standpoint is so much bigger, because of these LGBTQI free zones and legislation that is going backwards. So I think it's very, very important to be very, very clear on the Swedish position, and to not be afraid to make that very, very clear.
I take it your Polish counterpart won't be marching with you in the...
Well, I'm actually very curious to see who will take part of this Pride parade, because it's the cost, everyone who's in this parade, we still have, of course, a lot of issues in Sweden, and there are threats, of course, but I think the situation in Poland is so different, and the right to love and to show love to whoever you want is so much more questioned there, and that's why it's even more important to make a standpoint.
I'd like to look at, I'll ask a similar question to you, Ambassador, because I think if we, obviously the United States is incredibly influential in many of these countries within, if we start within the EU, are these questions that your counterparts in those countries, you believe, are taking up with their colleagues over there? Is this an important issue for the bilateral relationship between the US and Italy, for example, or Poland or Hungary?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Not only is human rights a cornerstone of our foreign policy, but specifically LGBTQI rights and advancing them worldwide is very much a part. I actually am very proud to be one of 12 U.S. LGBT ambassadors. Sadly, only LGB at the moment, but we'll hopefully get there soon, including, who serve... David Pressman serves in Hungary. We have ambassadors in Cameroon and Paraguay, places that are not bastions of LGBT rights at the moment, are working very, very hard across the board, a spectrum of countries and where they are at in recognition of are universal human rights that have been universally recognized at the United Nations. This is, again, part of our, it's absolutely part of our foreign policy priorities. We have a pride banners not only at our embassy but in the embassy in Warsaw. And the U.S. ambassador there, Mark Brzezinski, who was once the U.S. ambassador to Sweden not so long ago, will be marching in that parade as well. So, there is always more work to do, but it is very much prioritized.
I'd like to ask the other two members of the panel, sort of from a more oppositional perspective. Are you happy with the way Sweden in particular, and I'd be interested in your comments on America as well, how they're working to ensure that other countries within the EU are being held, that their feet are being held to the fire on LGBTQI rights. Are you satisfied to start with the Swedish government? Are you satisfied with how they're acting on these issues?
I think definitely that more can be done. It's very over the years it's been very obvious that countries who are in the process of potentially joining the European Union, that's when the human rights movement have their best shot. And that's been the case in all prospect countries, or any country that is about to maybe be able to join. That's the chance for the LGBTI movement and other movements to kind of then the EU says you have to have anti-discrimination legislation, you have to have several things. So that's their chance then to do that. But then, as many have commented over the years, once you're a member, then the kind of methods that you can use are a bit more limited, and I don't think that enough has been done. Basically, that would be wrong to say that has been the case. We've seen Hungary for a very long time, Poland, and then also now. What's the problem now is obviously then that we see other countries joining them. So it's it has to be done more, and also maybe a little bit quick before more countries then decide to, for example, follow Italy's ideas that you can even then remove rights that also Hungary and Poland has done before. So it's because this is definitely a new level of harassing your own population, that you not only are stalling progress and not doing reforms, but you're even taking back rights that you once had. And that you can do that even as a member state of the European Union is obviously very offensive, and I think for all of us so I think that more should be done, and there is a big it's such a big gap between the vision of the Commission and, for example, in this LGBTI strategy that they have, which is good, which is quite radical, and also there are many things to follow in that also for Sweden. So we have that on one hand, and then you have member states who have absolutely zero intention of following this strategy or making any sorts of efforts, but are making, rather than trying to make the lives for their own populations more miserable, basically. So,
what can Sweden do? What could Sweden do to try and what could the European Commission do to try and push these countries in a more liberal direction? Is there anything you would like to see?
If I had this is how you do it, then I promise that I would say that. But I don't think that anybody knows. But I am assuming that it's continuing the dialogue is super important, obviously, but also holding accountable, etc. All the things which I'm sure is being done, but then also taking responsibility for your own countries. Then, so not kind of stalling progress in your own countries, not being lazy because other countries are not doing. Other countries are really misbehaving. So don't blame us. We're really good compared to look at them. So that's also a way of kind of trying to lead by example. Then too, but also definitely keeping the dialogue open and continuing to push things, even if you understand that this is many things in this strategy is never going to become a reality, I'm sure, but it's still a vision. It's still something to strive for, so it's a positive thing. So I don't have the magic trick, unfortunately.
Peter, do you have a magic trick?
Unfortunately, I don't have that up my sleeve, but I would like to add that I think it's important. We talked about visibility earlier, and I think it's really important that we actually work towards furthering human rights within the countries in the EU where we actually have the momentum to do that. Because just as much as just as much as we're inspired by positive examples, people can be and will be inspired by negative examples. And we see more and more countries rolling back rights of LGBTQ people, and I think it's absolutely pivotal that we work towards enshrining and making sure that the rights that we have gained are not being rolled back in the countries where we have a broad majority that supports our rights, and we should use that to. We should also find ways to support the LGBTQ and the human rights movements in the countries where the rights are being rolled back at the moment. I think that's also really important, because I think the capacity building in these countries is also absolutely important, because otherwise we might end up in a situation where the rights are being questioned because they're considered to be a foreign and pushed by foreign entities in these countries, and so I think that's important. And just to add on the strategy as well, it's the strategy is valid until 2025, and the question is now what happens with the strategy, considering the political situation and the chairmanship within the union now. Will we have a new strategy, considering that Poland and Hungary will be responsible for setting the agenda of the union in a very short future?
Yeah. I'd like to move on from the EU right now, because we're seeing if we have problems here in our backyard, there are other parts of the world where the problems are even more significant. And I'm thinking particularly in recent months of in parts of Africa, particularly Uganda, but now we've just seen, as we were talking about earlier, a new anti-gay law, similar anti-gay law in Ghana. It's not just anti-gay, anti-LGBTQI rights. It's affecting people across the spectrum. And so one of the ways that Western countries have tried to handle this is by threatening with sanctions, talking about development aid, and using that to try and influence events in these countries. Ambassador Ramanathan, I'd like to ask you, with the US has threatened sanctions against Uganda, how do you use sanctions? How do you use the different levers that America has at its disposal without pushing these countries just further away from America and potentially into the arms of countries like Russia, who are even more virulently homophobic, at least among their leadership, than these countries?
Yeah, well, I think we have to start with the recognition that the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda is absolutely abhorrent. It's completely against universal human rights, and we have to call these things out. We absolutely must do that, and the question is, what is the most effective way to push back? I'm as equally concerned about the copycat of bad example spreading as I am about things getting worse in Uganda. And the reality is, our commitment to Uganda is still, has been incredibly high, and we invest. The United States invests about $1 billion a year in Uganda. I mean, so it's not just the sanctions that we're talking about. Obviously, some of that involves that piece, but there are that $1 billion investment goes everything from from private sector efforts to trade and everything else. So beyond whatever sanctions may or may not be imposed, there's also a broader effect that I think we all, if we're all calling them out. I mean, I think it's incredibly important that the United States not be the only one, going to that level of very severely calling it out, and that needs to happen across our community of shared values, and it really needs to. And we've seen how much more effective sanctions are. Not to digress too much, into the Russia situation, which I know everybody's worried about, that overshadowing these issues, but we see with the effectiveness of sanctions against Russia, that solidarity across the EU and across the community of shared values have made those incredibly more effective. That businesses, actually pulling out of Russia and doing other things have amplified that effect to an enormous extent. So it's very important that kind of thing also happens in Uganda, in reaction to this kind of, this is a law that puts people in fear of their lives, that legitimizes violence, and completely, desecuritize, an entire population within Uganda. It's just, we have to together call that out.
Yeah. Paulina, how is Sweden and how should Sweden be dealing with countries in other parts of the world? How should the European Union be dealing with countries in other parts of the world that are implementing laws of this kind?
I agree with the ambassador here that it's very important to call this out and to make a clear standpoint from governments, and that is something that we've done from the Swedish government. We've been very clear with the Ugandan government that this is completely unacceptable. It's in violation with international law and also Uganda's own constitution. So it's just unacceptable, but that's too weak. It's horrible. Of course, you want to look at different measures, what you can do. I want to be clear that in Sweden, we at this point, we do not give any development support to Uganda's government. What we do is that we try to give support, among other things, to civil society, because that's one way to go, because they are... when you have these kind of movements, the need for a strong civil society is bigger than ever. So I think that's one very concrete thing that you can do as a foreign government to try to help pushing things in the right direction.
Can I ask the other two members of the panel, are we doing enough? Is there more we could do? Is there something we could do in Uganda that we're not already doing? Or Ghana, or many of these other countries that have these issues?
Well, the last time around, then, about 10 years ago, when this law first appeared as an idea from the Ugandan government, then we had a very close contact with the Ugandan LGBTI movement, and also the then Minister of International Aid, which was from the moderate party, Hillevi Engström, I think. And we had a good dialogue, what do the Ugandan civil society want, which is then, I think, very necessary to always be sure that you're doing what they say is the right move. And then they basically at that point said, don't threaten to cut the aid, was what they said to us. Because then, for example, aid went to maternity health and things like that. So that if you cut that, we're going to be blamed for dead mothers and babies. So that's just going to make our situation even worse. So it's very specific. So you have to be sure that you have the right information and that you're in contact with the affected populations and that you respect what they're saying. Then of course you have to take responsibility yourself. But it's to be in close connection with the civil society and human rights activists in the affected country is crucial, I would say, so that they can inform you, so that you can then make an informed decision based on what they're saying, what different moves would effects they would have. But also now then we're not giving any aid to the government in Uganda, which I think is a good idea at the moment, of course. So it's but then not leaving the civil society and the organizations behind, but also of course making sure that the civil society organizations who are accepting the aid, that they're also respecting human rights for everyone, so that you don't accidentally give support to organizations who are maybe countering the rights of, for example, LGBTI people, which can definitely sometimes be the case, although they might do other good work. So you have to, it's a little bit, you have to look at all the details. It's quite complicated.
Do you agree with that approach?
Yes, I totally agree. plus one to what what Ulrika just said. I think it's really important to understand how sanctions affect the communities in the countries, especially the LGBTQ community, which is a very vulnerable community, and listen to their voices and take that into consideration. I also think that it's important to continue working capacity building and helping and trying to help these communities, but being very aware of their needs and their perspectives when planning different kinds of actions.
Great. Well, I think we have time for a few questions from or contributions from the audience. So does anyone have anything they'd like to ask this panel now that we have them? Yeah.
Hello. Maybe to Paulina and Ulrika primarily. How do your respective parties want to support also the global LGBTI movement in these trying times? We were talking a bit about foreign aid, about helping LGBTI communities. How do you want to strengthen the international movements? Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Well, now that we are part of the government, of course, it's part of the work, the entire work that we're doing, and then I think channeling development support to civil society. I personally think that is the most important measure to take, because as we said here, I mean, we have in Sweden a very strong LGBTQI plus movement. We have, as you said, 100 Pride celebrations in Sweden. I think, I mean, the stronger the anti-movement gets, the stronger you have to have, you know, the more urgent is the need for a strong civil society to you know, push back the pushbacks. So I think that's that is the most important measure to try to channel the development support right.
Ulrika.
Yeah, it's we're of course interested in to see what the coming promised changes to the international aid is going to be, because the government has so far just said that there's going to be like substantial changes. But exactly what those are going to be is not yet known, or like it's a work in progress as we understand it. But it's been said, for example, that you want to prioritize humanitarian aid and also Ukraine as a general direction, and like these are also very important things, but of course from our perspective it's also super important then to make sure that you're not cutting down on aid that goes to work on democracy, human rights, like more long term, not just like catastrophes, but also like making sure then that, as you said, that civil society remains strong and that it's possible to work more long term to make stable societies that respect human rights for all. So that's what we are going to be keeping an eye on to make sure that that stays the case, because Sweden is a very, very substantial player in the international aid community, and we wanted to that this is how it's going to remain if the Green Party gets to decide. So that's what we want to see.
Is it similar from the US?
Oh, I was going to say, I particularly, I mean, your comments definitely resonated. For example, the Global Equality Fund, which directly helps human rights activists in these other, frontier countries, is, Sweden is an anchor. From the start, founding member of that fund, incredibly important. And if any of that funding, were to go down, I know we've done our best to redouble our efforts. That would be a real blow to human rights and LGBT rights specifically for those human rights defenders.
Yeah, there's a question there.
Hello, my name is John. Regarding the prospect countries to the EU, I remember that in the 90s, EU introduced a prerequisite for new member countries, and also the existing ones, of course, to abolish the death penalty before becoming a member, to be even considered as members. And that was good in a way that it was an indirect way of raising these issues in the prospect countries, and you were not perceived as someone who tried to influence the internal politics. Is that a way that you could go forward also in these issues?
Yeah, so new member states, applicant countries. We have quite a lot of applicant countries to the EU right now. Ukraine is one of them. Turkey is another, which suddenly seems a bit more interested in joining the EU than it was. I think someone said earlier that we do use this again in the application process.
Yeah, it depends on what you're referring to, because it's then there are requirements such as you have to have anti-discrimination legislation, for example, but there are not like you have to have equal marriage or things like that. That's like considered something that the states can decide by themselves. So it depends on what you're.
Should we be more specific?
And say then you have to have equal marriage and you have to have legal gender recognition based on self-identification, or it's like because it's some of them. I think the anti-discrimination legislation and that you can't like that is like an absolute requirement, which is good. So that's something that definitely has come up in the Ukraine. The LGBTI movement there have looked at this for like a very, very, very long time, and that's what they're going for. And also many other prospect countries are like, the EU says this, we have to have it. So it is a strict requirement, but there are many rights for the LGBTI community that are not kind of included, and which maybe also be a bit difficult then, because not all EU countries have those at the moment. So it's more than you have to at least be on par with the kind of the work that is required on an EU level. So it's not like death penalty, yes or no. It's more there are a number of different legislations that you could like demand that you introduce. So it's a bit more complicated, I think.
Yeah, and then I can say also, I mean, not only the prospect countries, also the countries that are already EU members. I mean, there are, of course, EU can be used to put pressure on member states. Now, there is one case against Hungary because of their anti-LGBTIQ legislation. And this is a case that has been initiated by the Commission, and many countries, Sweden amongst others, have intervened in this case. So I think that is a very important way to put pressure on member states and not only prospect states. Then on a general level, in a EU context, I can often get frustrated at things that we in Sweden consider basic human rights. I mean, we have LGBTQI rights, we also have abortion rights, things that for us should be self-evident. In an EU context, it's not as self-evident. So I would like to have a lot of more, to raise the bar on what your demand from EU states, but within the EU there has to be a consensus on, okay, where do we put this limit? And Sweden is, even if we are, falling down on this list, we are still in the forefront when it comes to our view on these rights. And it's a fact that many other EU countries don't share our views, and then it's very important to find a common way of, common level on what kind of pressure you should put on member states, what kind of demands you should make on other member states.
Yeah. What do you think, Peter? Is there a way to use the EU accession process to advance LGBTQI rights?
Well, I think it's important to have a clear baseline and also to stand up for human rights, because I think it's important to create a context where we talk about why we have these rights to begin with, because these are human rights, and we have a lot of and that should be the reason why we're working with these rights. And you can use the if you put pressure on prospect countries, you could perhaps bring attention to the fact that a rollback of rights usually never ends there. You start with one group and then you just continue rolling back these rights. But it's within an EU context. It's also it is a bit tricky to put forward specific actions as the rules look like now.
Ambassador, do you have anything? I don't know whether you want to comment EU.
Probably no. I don't have anything to add.
Avoiding commenting EU.
Yeah, that's probably for the best.
Well, that sort of brings us to the end there. I'd just like to finish by asking, if we were to sort of sum up, would you say that you're optimistic about the future for LGBTQI rights in the world? Are we going in the right direction or in the wrong direction now? I think there have been a few. I've heard a few different things during this panel discussion. Are we optimistic, broadly optimistic, or broadly pessimistic? Are we going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Paulina?
I'm going to give a very political answer. I think I'm optimistic when it comes to legislation that will push Sweden in the right direction. We have a lot of important legislation on its way. We have, as we said, the Gender Identification Act. We also have, we're working on dealing with conversion therapy, things that we have not talked about before, but, things that we really need to handle and deal with. And I think we will get in place very important pieces of legislation dealing with these very acute and concrete problems. On the other hand, I am worried about the movements that are threatening these rights. And I mean, we see both the far right movement and also now there are other movements. We see with this Quran crisis, we see countries burning not only the Swedish flag but also pride flag. I think we need to be. I must say that I'm worried, and I think it's very important to never sit back and always try to work hard on these issues.
Ambassador Ramanathan.
I think I'm overall quite optimistic, and it's really because of people like you, all of you in this room, including particularly the young faces, including my own daughter who's here and is a trans leader of the future, an aspiring political leader herself. I really think that is, in the end of the day, is having these kind of conversations and having this kind of energy that's going to be required. Of course, I am concerned about the vitriol of the moment, the fact that LGBT populations and trans populations in particular continue to be, or may even be more than we've seen in the past, the scapegoats of anti-human rights activity around the world. They are the refuge of despots looking to get a majority on their side, seeking to have a more authoritarian rule by picking on a relatively small minority that's historically been perhaps not popular in that country, even though people recognize often in these countries that human rights are important, and that's what they should be striving towards. So I worry about the future. It is going to continue to be a fight, just as it's been a fight we've come a long ways in 35 years, and I would like to think in 35 years we will be just as far forward from where we are, but whether that's a straight line or a lot of fits and starts and a lot to fight through as a community, I don't know. So we need everybody in this room. And frankly, we don't just need the people in this room. We need our allies, our families, our straight allies, our business leaders and others. And that's frankly what a lot of this needs to be. There needs to be a conversation where not just, people who are already on board with this movement, but also are maybe less familiar with the issues that we're facing and the impacts that we all face, can also be champions. And I see, more of that. I see an awful lot of that in this country, but I think there's a need for even more if we're really going to do the hard work to keep it moving forward.
How about you, Ulrika? Are we going to be as much further on 35 years from now as we are further on from where we were 35 years ago?
If we look in a perspective of 35 years, I think so, yes. But I'm right now, I think my main feeling is that I'm worried, actually, which is like not quite good. It's like more than I have felt before, I think, since I started in this movement. So it's this combined resistance from a number of different actors that is causing problems, and not just in Sweden, but in many countries, and it's like feeding on each other. So I would say I'm mostly worried, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that like positive reforms can happen. That I do think, but this very hateful environment often that shows up on like not also social media and in other contexts is a real problem. And it's like maybe it's not affecting all legislation, but it's definitely affecting people's lives, and how much people are daring to speak out and kind of continue to fight, which is of course exactly what these actors want. They want people to be silent and not continue to stand up for their rights. That's the kind of whole purpose of being very aggressive and hateful on social media, for example. So I'm definitely worried, but I also think that we're going to see progress, and like in the long run, if we're talking about decades, then I think that we're going to continue to see progress, but that doesn't come without people working for it. So, and people then need to be able to stand up against hatred and resistance. So, and understand that this is going to come your way, and you're just going to have to continue, unfortunately, if we're going to see this progress. So it's not going to come by itself. So.
And Peter, as if it's not going to come by itself, I guess RFSL and organisations like yours are going to be crucial for it. As co-host of this panel discussion today, maybe you'd like to finish off with your thoughts.
Thank you. I think, in general, I'm leaning towards the optimistic. If I look at RFSL, for example, we have more members than ever. We have more local branches than ever, and we have a broad acceptance in society for our organization and for the questions that we try to for our questions. So that's positive, but on the other hand, we see an increased resistance towards our movement, our organization, locally, not nationally yet, but locally. We see, for example, in cities, local city councils are calling into questions our for example, own rules about whom we want to talk to, and there are some places where, for example, the Sweden Democrats have gained power, where our movement is called into question altogether, and we also see a rollback of, for example, visibility happening in Sweden. We have cities in Sweden where the rainbow flag, for example, is considered to be too political to be flown in public places, so that's worrying. And at the same time, we have at a more national level, we have this discourse, this anti-rights discourse that is actually what it's doing. It's eating away at our general acceptance of universal human rights. That human rights are indivisible and they're for everyone, and we shouldn't be pitting groups against each other. That's what's happening. We have voices that are sort of trying to make that the new normal, as it were. And I think the danger here is, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really end there. It's you take one group and then you continue with other groups, and then you just keep rolling back rights until you reach some sort of perceived, yeah.
Well, on that note, we're running a little over time, so I'd just like to thank the panel, Paulina Brandberg, Erik Ramanathan, Ulrika Westerlund, and and Peter and Peter Sidlund Ponkala. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for all coming today. It's been really interesting to hear all your points on a very important set of issues. And good to hear that there's at least some optimism left in the panel, despite all the difficult times that we're going through. So thank you very much to the panel.